The grand halls of the Velmorian palace shone with golden light, reflecting off the tall crystal pillars that stretched toward the high ceilings. It was a place of elegance, tradition, and power, where every step was measured, every word carefully chosen. Tonight, the hall was filled with nobles and officials from across the galaxy, gathered for an important diplomatic event. Among them stood Ethan Carter, a human diplomat representing Earth. He was dressed in a formal suit, standing tall but feeling slightly out of place among the towering Zephyrians, an alien race known for their sharp intellect, strict customs, and striking silver-blue skin. Ethan had spent years studying different cultures, but the Zephyrians remained a mystery. They spoke with cold precision, their faces always calm, never revealing emotions. As he observed the room, his eyes stopped at someone unexpected. At the center of the hall, surrounded by nobles, stood Princess Zayara, the heir to the Zephyrian throne. Unlike the others, she seemed different, not in appearance but in presence. She was tall like her people, her silver skin glowing under the soft lights, her deep violet eyes scanning the room with quiet curiosity. But there was something more. She was looking at him. Ethan realized, with mild surprise, that she had been observing him just as he had been observing her. Their eyes met for a brief moment before she turned away, speaking to an elder noble, but something in her expression, just a flicker, was different from the others. It wasn't cold or distant. It was curiosity. Ethan smiled slightly. He had read that Zephyrians were logical beings, ruled by reason, not emotion. Yet here was a princess showing signs of something else. Before he could think further, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Why are you looking at me like that, human?" Ethan turned to see Princess Zayara standing in front of him. The surrounding nobles had quieted, watching the exchange with interest. Her voice was calm, but her words carried weight. It wasn't a simple question. It was a challenge. Ethan met her gaze. "I was just curious." Zayara's head tilted slightly. "Curious? About what?" He hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Your people don't usually show emotions, but just now, when you looked at me, it felt different." A murmur passed through the crowd. Zephyrians were not used to being questioned like this, especially not by a human. But Zayara did not seem offended. Instead, she studied him, her violet eyes searching his face for answers. "Emotions are distractions," she said after a pause. "They cloud judgment. That is what I was taught." Ethan nodded. "Maybe. But emotions also help us understand each other." Zayara's expression did not change, but she did not dismiss his words either. Instead, she asked, "What do you mean?" Ethan glanced around, realizing they were gathering too much attention. He lowered his voice. "Do you want to know what it's like to be human? To feel emotions the way we do?" Zayara hesitated. A Zephyrian noble nearby cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. But for the first time, the princess did not immediately follow tradition. Instead, she said, "Yes. Tell me." Ethan was surprised, but he kept his expression neutral. He gestured toward the grand balcony overlooking the city. "Then maybe we should talk somewhere less public." Zayara considered for a moment, then turned to her attendants. "I wish to take a walk. Alone." The nobles exchanged glances, but no one dared to argue. Ethan followed her onto the balcony, where the city of Velmora stretched out below them, its skyline shimmering under the twin moons. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of alien flowers from the palace gardens. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Zayara broke the silence. "How do emotions help humans understand each other?" Ethan smiled slightly. "It's hard to explain. But emotions connect us. They show what words can't." Zayara frowned. "Give me an example." Ethan thought for a moment, then said, "When humans laugh, it means they are happy or amused. When they cry, it means they are sad. These emotions allow us to comfort each other, to share experiences." Zayara's eyes narrowed in thought. "We do not cry. We do not laugh. but we still function as a society. That's true, Ethan agreed. But do you ever wonder if something is missing? She did not answer right away. Instead, she looked out over the city, her expression unreadable. I have never thought about it before, she admitted. Ethan watched her closely. There was something beneath her words, something she was not saying. You hesitated just now, he said. That means you feel something, doesn't it? Ziyara turned to face him, studying him once more. Finally, she spoke in a softer voice, one almost uncertain. I do not know what it means to feel. Ethan's smile grew. Then maybe. I can teach you. For the first time that night, the corner of Ziyara's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. And in that moment, Ethan realized something important. This was not just a conversation. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The cool night breeze swept across the grand balcony, carrying the distant hum of the Velmorian city below. The twin moons cast a soft silver glow on the marble floor, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. Princess Ziyara stood at the edge, her gaze fixed on the horizon, deep in thought. Ethan watched her closely. There was something different about this moment. He had met many alien diplomats, but none had ever asked him about human emotions. Most saw them as weaknesses, yet here she was, a Zephyrian princess, heir to a powerful empire, questioning what she had been taught her entire life. Finally, she turned to him. Teach me. Ethan leaned against the railing, thinking carefully. Emotions are not something I can just explain. They have to be experienced. Ziyara frowned slightly. But how do I experience something I do not understand? He smiled. Let's start simple. When you saw me earlier and decided to speak to me, what were you feeling? She hesitated. Curious. Ethan nodded. Good. Curiosity is an emotion. It makes us want to learn more, to explore the unknown. Ziyara considered his words, her violet eyes narrowing in thought. Then I suppose I have felt curiosity before. Ethan chuckled. That's a start. Now tell me, have you ever been afraid? She stiffened slightly. Zephyrians do not fear. He raised an eyebrow. Never. She hesitated again, then spoke carefully. Fear is seen as weakness. It clouds judgment. Ethan sighed. Fear can be dangerous, yes, but it can also protect you. It tells you when something is wrong, when you need to be careful. Humans feel fear all the time, but we also learn to overcome it. Ziyara studied him. You believe overcoming fear makes one stronger? Absolutely. She looked away again, back at the city lights below. There was something in her posture, an almost imperceptible tension. For a brief moment, Ethan wondered, had she ever felt fear before? But she didn't say anything, and he didn't push her. Instead, he decided to change the topic. All right, he said, let's try something else. Happiness. Ziyara tilted her head. Happiness. It's the feeling you get when something good happens, when you achieve something important, or spend time with someone you care about. She was silent for a long moment. I do not know if I have ever felt that. Ethan frowned. Nothing at all. Not even when you were a child. Ziyara's expression remained neutral. From the moment we are old enough to understand, we are trained for duty. There is no time for foolish emotions. Ethan exhaled. He couldn't imagine growing up like that, without laughter, without joy. That sounds lonely. She blinked, as if the thought had never occurred to her. Loneliness is an irrelevant concept. One cannot miss what one has never had. Ethan shook his head. That's not true. Even if you don't have something, your heart can still long for it. Ziyara seemed almost uncomfortable. But then, to Ethan's surprise, she asked, and what about you, human? Do you feel loneliness? Ethan hesitated. He hadn't expected the conversation to turn back to him. But there was something in her gaze, genuine curiosity, maybe even something more. Yes, he admitted. Sometimes. She studied him for a long moment as if trying to understand. And how do humans stop feeling lonely? Ethan smiled slightly. By forming bonds with others. Friends, family, people we trust. Ziyara considered his words. Then, after a long pause, she said something unexpected. Then perhaps, I would like to learn more about this bond. Ethan's smile widened. I'd be happy to teach you. For the first time, Ziyara did something he never expected. She reached out, just slightly, as if unsure, and brushed her fingers against his. The touch was brief, almost imperceptible. But in that moment, something shifted, perhaps for the first time in her life. The curious alien princess had felt something new. Ethan felt the brief touch of Ziyara's fingers before she pulled her hand back. It had been just a fleeting moment, but he could see something had changed in her. Her expression remained calm, but there was a new kind of awareness in her violet eyes. She was thinking, processing. For a long moment, she stood still, as if unsure whether to step forward or retreat. Finally, she broke the silence. That was strange. Ethan smiled slightly. Touch can carry meaning. It can comfort, reassure, or express emotions we can't put into words. Ziyara tilted her head, her golden hair catching the moonlight. In Zephyrian culture, physical contact is rare. It is reserved for combat or necessity. Ethan leaned back against the marble railing, watching her carefully. Then why did you reach out? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at her fingers, as if they held some secret she couldn't yet understand. I do not know, she admitted finally. Ethan chuckled. That's the first step, acting on emotion before you fully understand it. Ziyara frowned slightly. That sounds reckless. Maybe, Ethan said. But some of the best things in life come from taking chances. Ziyara folded her arms. Is that how humans live? By taking risks without knowing the outcome. Ethan grinned. Pretty much. She shook her head. That seems inefficient. Ethan laughed. It can be. But it also allows us to grow. Ziyara thought about his words, then turned her gaze back to the city below. The Velmorian skyline stretched out beneath them, a sea of glowing towers and floating transport ships. Everything was structured, orderly, so unlike the chaotic cities of Earth. Finally, she spoke again. You said humans form bonds to avoid loneliness. Do all humans do this? Ethan nodded. Most of us. It's part of who we are. Ziyara hesitated before asking, and you? Do you have these bonds? Ethan's smile faded slightly. He thought about Earth, about the people he had left behind. His family, his friends, the long-distance messages that grew fewer as time passed. I used to, he admitted, but being out here, far from home, it's not always easy. Ziyara studied him. Then why do you stay? Ethan exhaled. Because there's more to the universe than just one place. I want to see it, experience it, meet people like you. She blinked, caught off guard by his words. Like me. He nodded. Someone different. Someone with a unique way of thinking. That's why I signed up for this diplomatic mission. To learn. Ziyara turned back toward the city, her face unreadable. Perhaps we are not so different then. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? She hesitated, then said, as a princess, I am expected to follow tradition. But I have always been curious. Ethan smirked. I noticed. She shot him a sharp look but didn't seem offended. Instead, she sighed. My people see humans as reckless, emotional beings. They believe our strength is in discipline, not in emotion. Ethan leaned closer. And what do you believe? She was silent for a long time. Finally, she said, I do not know anymore. Ethan smiled. Then maybe it's time you find out for yourself. She turned to look at him again, her violet eyes thoughtful. Then, to his surprise, she reached out once more, this time with more certainty. Her fingers brushed against his hand, And this time, she did not pull away immediately. Ethan met her gaze, understanding passing between them. This was the beginning of something new. Zayara's fingers rested against Ethan's hand for a few moments before she slowly pulled away. Though the touch was brief, something had shifted between them. There was no longer just curiosity in her violet eyes. There was something deeper. Ethan didn't rush to speak. He knew when to let silence do the work. Zayara finally exhaled and turned toward the city once more. "You are not what I expected, human." Ethan smirked. "What did you expect?" She paused before answering. "Someone more chaotic, undisciplined, reckless." He chuckled. "So basically a troublemaker." She nodded. "Yes, that is how humans are described among my people." Ethan folded his arms. "Well, we can be, but we're also capable of learning, adapting, even surprising you, it seems." Zayara's lips curled slightly, almost a smile. Perhaps. For a moment, they stood together in the quiet, looking at the glowing city below. Velmoria was unlike anything on Earth. Towers of smooth silver, streets that hovered in the air, an atmosphere that shimmered faintly under the twin moons. Yet despite its alien beauty, Ethan felt something familiar in the way the people moved below, living their lives just like humans did. Finally, Zayara broke the silence. "I must ask you something, Ethan." He glanced at her. "Go ahead." She turned fully to face him, her golden hair shining under the soft lights. "Why do humans trust so easily?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You think we trust too easily?" "Yes." She nodded. "Your species forms connections quickly. You open your hearts without hesitation. Why?" Ethan leaned against the railing, thinking. "I guess it's because we believe in possibilities. If we never trust, we never grow. Sure, sometimes we get hurt, but that's part of the risk." Zayara considered his words carefully. "That is dangerous." Ethan shrugged. "Maybe, but it's also worth it." She studied him for a moment, then asked, "And do you trust me?" Ethan met her gaze. He saw no deception in her eyes, only the weight of a question she wasn't asking lightly. "Yes," he said simply. Zayara blinked. "Just like that?" Ethan smiled. "Just like that." She shook her head. "You are either very wise or very foolish. Maybe both." She stared at him for a long time before sighing. "This is difficult for me to understand." Ethan softened his tone. "Then don't try to understand it all at once. Just take one step at a time." Zayara hesitated before nodding. "Very well. One step." Ethan grinned. "That's a good start." She glanced down at her hand, the one that had touched his earlier, before looking back at him. "What is the next step?" Ethan held out his hand to her. "Trusting me enough to take it." Zayara stared at his hand, uncertainty flickering across her face. But after a moment, she slowly reached forward and placed her hand in his. Their fingers intertwined, and in that small, quiet moment, an unspoken agreement passed between them. This was no longer just curiosity. It was the beginning of trust. Zayara's fingers tightened slightly around Ethan's hand. It was the first time she had willingly held onto someone like this, and she could feel the warmth of his skin against hers. It was strange, but not unpleasant. Ethan didn't move, letting her take her time. He could see the thoughts running through her mind, the way she struggled between what she had been taught and what she was beginning to feel. "Is this normal for humans?" she asked at last. Ethan tilted his head, holding hands. She nodded. He chuckled. "Yeah, it's pretty normal. It's a simple way to show trust, comfort, or just to feel connected." Zayara glanced down at their joined hands, her expression unreadable. "It feels different." Ethan smiled. "Different how?" She hesitated before answering. "It makes me aware of something I cannot name." Ethan's gaze softened. "Maybe you don't have to name it. Maybe you just have to feel it." Zayara's violet eyes met his, searching for something. Perhaps an answer, perhaps reassurance. Before she could say anything more, the soft hum of approaching footsteps caught their attention. Ziyara immediately pulled her hand away, her posture shifting back to its usual regal stance. Ethan sighed inwardly, but didn't react. He understood. This was all new to her, and she wasn't ready to be seen like this. The Zephyrian royal guard stepped onto the balcony, his silver armor reflecting the moonlight. His reptilian eyes flickered between them before bowing slightly. "Princess Ziyara," he said formally, "your presence is requested in the Grand Hall." Ziyara nodded, her expression carefully composed. "I will be there shortly." The guard hesitated before adding, "The Council wishes to discuss the upcoming treaty. They are concerned about the human delegation." Ethan smirked slightly. "Let me guess. They don't trust us." The guard's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. Ziyara turned to Ethan. "I must go." Ethan nodded. "Of course. Duty calls." She hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. "Will you remain here?" Ethan caught the unspoken meaning in her words. She wanted to know if he would still be here when she returned. He smiled. "I'm not going anywhere." Ziyara gave him one last look before turning and walking away, her golden robes flowing behind her. The guard followed closely, throwing a suspicious glance back at Ethan before disappearing into the palace. Ethan sighed and leaned against the railing again. He knew this was going to be difficult. The Zephyrians didn't trust humans, and Ziyara had been raised to believe that trust was something to be earned, not given freely. But she was starting to question those beliefs, and that was enough. He looked out at the city below, wondering what the council was discussing. Was the peace treaty truly at risk, or was there something deeper going on? Whatever it was, Ethan had a feeling that tonight was just the beginning. Ethan paced back and forth on the balcony, his hands in his pockets, waiting for Ziyara to return. He had a bad feeling about this meeting. The way the guard had spoken, the way Ziyara had hesitated. Something wasn't right. The Zephyrians didn't trust humans. That much had been clear from the beginning. And now, with the peace treaty on the table, they would be even more cautious. But what worried Ethan the most was Ziyara herself. She was caught between two worlds, her duty to her people, and the new thoughts forming in her heart. Could she truly stand up for what she believed in? Ethan sighed, leaning against the railing. He didn't know how much time had passed before he finally heard soft footsteps approaching. He turned, expecting to see Ziyara, but instead, another Zephyrian stood before him. It was an elder, his silver robe flowing down to his feet, his reptilian eyes cold and unreadable. "You are the human ambassador?" the elder asked, his voice calm but firm. Ethan straightened. "That's me." The elder studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "Princess Ziyara speaks highly of you." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That's so. She says you are different from other humans, that you seek understanding rather than power." Ethan shrugged. "I just believe in peace, and I believe in people, no matter where they come from." The elder's expression didn't change, and yet history tells us that trust in humans is dangerous. Ethan met his gaze. History is written by those who are afraid of change. For a moment, there was silence. Then the elder spoke in a quiet but sharp tone. "The council has made its decision." Ethan's hands clenched slightly. "And the treaty will proceed, but with conditions." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "What kind of conditions?" Before the elder could answer, another voice interrupted. "They want me to choose, Ethan." Ethan turned quickly to see Ziyara standing at the entrance to the balcony. Her expression was calm, but he could see the storm in her eyes. Ethan frowned. "Choose." Ziyara stepped forward. "They believe that my connection to you is dangerous, that it weakens my judgment." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. "And what does that mean?" The elder spoke again. "It means she must decide. Either she continues as the future ruler of Zephyria, or she walks a path that is no longer bound to our people." Ethan's heart pounded. They were making her choose between her people and her own feelings. Ziyara's hands clenched at her sides. They fear that my trust in you will change everything. Ethan took a deep breath. He knew what he wanted to say. He wanted to tell her that she didn't have to choose, that she could have both. But that wasn't how things worked in a world like this. So instead, he did something else. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "What do you want, Ziyara?" She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of the council, not fear of betrayal, fear of her own heart. "I don't know," she whispered. The elder watched them in silence, waiting for her answer. Ethan didn't press her. He just held her gaze, giving her space to think. Finally, she exhaled and turned to the elder. "I will give my answer tomorrow," she said. The elder nodded. "Very well." With that, he turned and disappeared into the palace, leaving them alone. Ethan sighed. "Ziyara." She shook her head. "I need time, Ethan." He nodded. "Then take it." She looked at him for a long moment before whispering, "Would you wait for me?" Ethan smiled gently. "Always." Ziyara's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something else. But in the end, she just gave a small nod before turning and walking away. Ethan watched her go, his chest heavy. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But one thing was certain. No matter what happened, everything was about to change. The grand hall of the Zephyrian palace was silent. All eyes were on Ziyara. The council members sat in their high seats, their expressions serious. Elite guards stood along the walls, their weapons at their sides. And in the center of it all, Ethan stood beside Ziyara, waiting for her answer. She had barely spoken to him since last night. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She wasn't just choosing between two paths. She was choosing the future of her people, her own life, and perhaps even the fate of peace between humans and Zephyrians. The High Counselor, an elder with deep violet scales and piercing golden eyes, finally spoke. "Princess Ziyara, you stand before this council today to give your decision. Will you remain on the path of leadership and fulfill your duty to the Zephyrian Empire? Or will you abandon your position and step into an uncertain future?" Ethan's chest tightened. They were making her sacrifice one part of herself for another. Ziyara lifted her chin, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I have spent my life believing that duty was the only path to honor. That to lead, one must follow the traditions of the past without question." She glanced at Ethan, her gaze softening for just a moment before she turned back to the council. "But then I met a human who showed me something different. He did not come here seeking power or conquest. He did not bow to fear or anger. Instead, he showed me the strength of understanding, of trust, of hope." A murmur spread through the hall. Some of the council members exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Ziyara took a deep breath and continued, "I will not abandon my people. I love my home, and I will always serve Zephyria. But I will not be a ruler who is trapped by fear of change." The High Counselor's gaze narrowed. "And what does that mean, Princess?" "It means I choose to lead in my own way," she declared firmly. "I will not turn my back on this alliance with humanity. I will stand for peace, and I will not cast aside those who have proven themselves to be our allies." Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. She wasn't running away. She was standing her ground. The High Counselor's expression was unreadable. Then he leaned forward slightly. "And what of the human?" His eyes flickered toward Ethan. "Where does he stand in your decision?" Silence fell once more. Ziyara turned, her gaze locking onto Ethan's. He saw hesitation for just a moment, not because she doubted herself, but because she was afraid of what this choice would mean. Finally, she spoke. "He is part of my future." Ethan's breath caught. A ripple of whispers spread through the hall, some of shock, others of anger. The High Counselor's gaze hardened. "You understand the consequences of such a declaration, Princess." Ziyara didn't flinch. "I do." For a long time, there was silence. Then the High Counselor sighed, leaning back in his seat. You have made your choice, and so has the Council. Ethan tensed. Was this the moment where they would try to strip her of her title? Would they turn against her? But then the elder did something unexpected. He smiled. A ruler who listens to their people, who seeks understanding rather than war. Perhaps this is exactly what Scifi needs. Ethan's eyes widened. They had expected her to bow to tradition. Instead, she had forced them to see another path. The High Counselor turned to the others. Let it be known that Princess Diara will take her place as the future ruler of Scifi, and this alliance with humanity shall continue. The room erupted into noise, some in agreement, others in protest. But it didn't matter. The decision had been made. Ethan exhaled, the weight of uncertainty finally lifting from his shoulders. He looked at Sayara, and for the first time, she looked truly free. She turned to him, a small smile forming on her lips. I hope you know what you've gotten yourself into, human. Ethan chuckled. Wouldn't have it any other way, princess. And as the council argued among themselves, as the future of Scifi and humanity shifted in ways no one had expected, Ethan and Sayara stood together, unshaken, unafraid, and ready for whatever came next. The end.